Hello and welcome back to the Elephant Lounge. I'm your host Tuesday. I want to thank you so much for joining me again. We are in episode 7 of Why They Are Guilty, and this is going to be a bit of a recap and review, and then we're going to talk about the ego and intellectual dishonesty. So let's talk a little bit more about the Russ Faria case. Now, if you haven't listened to the previous podcast, I recommend you go ahead and do so now. As with all the episodes in the series, I really want to stress the importance of listening to them in order as we are building upon ideas from the previous episodes. Now, in the case of Faria, we have some interesting elements, but there are a few topics that I want to recap. And one point of interest I want to go over is that even though Russ was eventually exonerated for the murder of his wife, we can admit that it's not unreasonable for the police to consider him a suspect. And what do I mean by that? Well, number one, we have a spouse. A spouse is always the first suspect. Now, murder is very rare between spouses. However, when it happens, it's very likely that the spouse is the perpetrator. Number two, Russ found his wife. He's the one that discovered her body. Number three, Russ exhibited concerning language commonly found among guilty people. His concern was about himself. Why did she do this to me? His immediate acceptance that she was dead. This is concerning because a lot of times what people have noticed is that when someone stumbles upon the body of their loved one, no matter how gruesome the scene might be, they will, if they're innocent, they will typically call an ambulance or they will want help, or it's very difficult for people to accept that the person that they love has actually died, especially so soon. And then we add to that this belief that she committed suicide, but there's a knife in her neck, and that's just not a common way to kill yourself. Although, to be fair, maybe Russ didn't know that. I don't know. But we'll just put it this way. Most women don't kill themselves violently. You know, we take pills or do other things that are a little bit less violent. It does happen, don't get me wrong, but it is very rare. Number four, police also discovered rather early on that Russ and his wife had both strayed at certain points during their marriage, meaning, you know, there could be a motive here. There could be a lover. There could be something else going on. Number five, certain family members, it seemed rather convinced Russ had committed the murder. So we're talking about Betsy's family. They didn't seem to have a problem accepting that Russ killed their daughter. They believed it immediately. Now, it's clear police zeroed in on their suspect and shut out all other evidence that would have run counter to their theory. They seemed to show no interest in paying attention to the actual person who last saw Betsy alive, Pam Hupp, nor did they seem to pay attention to the inconsistencies in her story, which there were many, and they didn't even seem to care that the beneficiary on Betsy's life insurance policy had just transferred to Pam just days before this murder had occurred. So what sets Russ apart from the guilty? Well, number one, Russ never wavered on his story. So though Russ's slippers had blood on them, he never offered an explanation for why, meaning he didn't try tailoring the evidence. As my friend Roberta Glass would say, please go over and subscribe to her channel if you have not done so already. But by admitting he has no explanation, he's showing a vulnerability that only innocent people would expose. Innocent people will not know why a piece of evidence is present. They're just not going to know because they didn't commit the crime. A guilty person, they're going to try and explain everything away. Guilty people will look for an excuse or a reason for evidence that suggests their guilt. So if the police present to you footprints in a hallway and you later on talk about how, oh yeah, I shimmied down the hallway with the bath mat and that's why my feet are in the hallway or whatever. You're trying to tailor the evidence. You're trying to go back and add a detail that you hadn't added before to explain a piece of evidence that might make you look guilty. This is very common among people who are guilty. He was always very consistent. He never changed his story. He was able to show receipts for his trips to the 2 gas stations as well as the Arby's he visited just before going home. Cameras at the gas stations confirm his location, and he was wearing the same clothing when police arrived. The pipes at the home were inspected. That confirmed he never took a shower or washed off blood. He also had alibis who were very firm in their description of Russ being at their home playing games, as well as the time that he arrived and when he left. Russ's phone records, they also confirm all of his whereabouts that night. There was never any inconsistencies. Nobody shut off their phone. He didn't just so happen to shut off his phone that night. It was actually left on. Now, guilty people rarely display this much consistency. Police should have been concerned at some point after Pam told them the story about Betsy being worried about telling Russ she wanted to move back home. Did they ask Betsy's family at all if this is a plan she had told them? I haven't found anything that confirms they ever followed up with that. This was never mentioned. It could be somewhere, maybe it's somewhere I didn't find, but it seems a little odd to me that this was never mentioned anywhere. I mean, that should be something that should be out in the open, that police would want the public to know we followed up with this. They also didn't recognize the major inconsistency here. This couldn't be a planned murder and a crime of passion. Pam's story actually takes out the element of a carefully planned attack, yet that would be the only way for this murder to have been carried out the way the prosecutor had described. So again, Pam's story was that, Betsy was really afraid about telling Russ that she wanted to move back home with her family to be close to her treatment center, and that Russ would be so mad and he could just fly into a rage. And this was Pam's way of trying to give police a motive. But at the same time, if he didn't know about it, it could not have been a crime of passion because there was no evidence of him washing off. His timeline fit correctly. Instead, this would have had to have been a planned murder. You just can't have it both ways. This case does indeed represent the nightmare that most everyone fears, right? Being wrongly accused of a crime you never committed and then being tried and convicted. It is this fear that a lot of us have, a lot of people have. Propaganda likes to play upon this. It wants to sell you this idea. This type of case, however, is quite rare. So the Russ Faria case, it's very rare, as one should expect. And it eventually fell apart, and it fell apart rather quickly. Although not quickly enough, but it did fall apart. Propaganda, it works hard to cover up these key elements of cases, distort them, and appeal to emotions and egos of their audience. So this leads us into the discussion of the ego and the part it plays in holding us back from being objective, appealing to the emotions of certain unaware individuals. And when I mean unaware individuals, I'm talking specifically about the people who would actually sit down and watch Making a Murderer and believe that it was truthful. And I say this because, I was 15 minutes in. I immediately recognized it as propaganda. I immediately recognized it as being lies. And that's when I went and looked up the documents and the police reports and all that other good stuff. And then months later, I went back to Making a Murderer, and I finally did finish it. It was awful. It was worse than I'd ever imagined, but it just goes to show that if you're unaware of how to recognize propaganda, you're going to get sucked up into this. It's going to be very easy. So from advertising to psychology, the concept of selling people something, this has long been studied. It's like a science in of itself, the science of selling, and it's been mastered by many people. There are a number of ways to to accomplish this mastery of selling things to people. And all these methods typically involve making the target feel important. So the goal is to always make the audience feel important. With true crime propaganda, the goal is not just to make a lot of money, but to feed the audience information in a way that makes them feel as though they've been let in on a secret or special information. And you'll notice that people who buy into these innocent stories and stuff, they always feel this special superiority, and they want to make sure that everyone knows how special they are and how much more they know than everyone, when in reality they just know a bunch of lies that have been told to them. They want you to believe that you, the audience member, know more than those who have spent their lives studying and investigating cases. They exploit a person's fear by confirming bias that's found in many individuals. So we all have this sort of fear of being accused, being locked up, being innocent. That fear that you have is then taken by these propagandists, and it's exploited, and they're manipulating you. And you have to ask yourself, why, if these people are searching for the truth, do they need to edit testimony to make it fit their narrative? Why do they need to edit somebody's interview with the police and take out the bad things that the suspect has said? Why would they feel the need to do this if, in fact, they are truth seekers? You need to ask yourself these questions. So essentially what they're trying to say is, look, this can happen to anyone, and even you can figure this out. You know better. You see what's going on here. Even you, the viewer, can figure out something so simple. These stupid government officials, the FBI, the forensic scientists, they know they are lying or they are stupid. So you see how that message, those types of message, are constantly being massaged into your mind, metaphorically speaking, but they're constantly being entertained and making the viewer feel as though they're special and that they're important and that they see what's going on here. Where is that going to go? What kind of message does that send to people? It makes them feel important. It makes them feel special. It strokes their ego. They are not focused on evidence. So propaganda doesn't care about evidence, but rather they are focused on their end goal, which is to say that so-and-so is innocent and it's justified by any means. They will then systematically dispute any information or evidence that works against their narrative. The experiment was wrong, or it was contaminated. The witnesses are lying. The victims are lying. The government was after them. The evidence was planted. Their behavior means nothing. Now, while some of these elements could be true, they will never be able to show you the definitive evidence of these claims. They will instead offer sinister inferences based on distorted interpretations of facts. Again, these are the fallacious arguments that I spoke about in I believe, episode 3. When a person is not aware of these tactics, these selling tactics, these propagandist tactics, they become subjected to this type of basic appeal to emotions, and their ego will follow and do so in a very strong way. Once a person has been convinced, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to undo the damage, since having to admit that they were manipulated or lied to can be too much for a person's ego. And it's fair to say that weak individuals do not want to admit they are wrong or manipulated, or that they've been manipulated. When confronted with the lies that they believe in, or the distortions they now believe in, they simply double down and can often ironically lash out, calling other people's sheep, or sort of projecting their own insecurities onto other people. Again, they are showing they are leading the evidence, they're not following it. However, when we do become aware of fallacious arguments, recognizing propaganda and we know what information we need to search for and we do so, it becomes much easier for us to separate useful information and facts from the nonsense and the distortions. And the more we work on it, the easier it becomes, the faster it becomes. It's sort of like a muscle, and the more you work it, the stronger it becomes. That's how clear thinking happens. We have to practice it. The individuals who possess strong egos typically will have a weak character and in turn become intellectually dishonest. And a lot of times for these people, you will see, who have these egos and they've fallen for a lie, what typically happens is they're incapable of admitting that they were manipulated or lied to or that they were wrong, because it can be a common occurrence with them that they have often been lied to and manipulated. And maybe that's happened to them before and they believe that it would never happen again, that they would never allow it to happen again. But because they didn't do the work on themselves to be more clear thinking, to be more aware, to be more conscientious of what people are saying, what people are doing, what behaviors to look for, because they never worked on themselves, it's just easier for them to be lied to again and again and again and again, and it becomes harder and harder and harder. So it's like they're working on a bad muscle, as it were. Like attracts like. And if you are somebody who has been manipulated many times, chances are it's going to continue to happen until you bring yourself to admit you're wrong about something. You have to take the ego out of your thinking. This is so very important, especially when we're dealing with these propagandist films or these so-called documentaries. You have to take your ego out of it. Now, as I said, this intellectual dishonesty that develops will prevent someone from having the ability to be objective when looking at cases. And this can affect other areas of their life as well. So it can create mass delusion in a way. And I have noticed that some people really do fall into this category of mass delusion, where if they believe one set of bizarre circumstances, they're more likely to believe in other sets of distortions. The intellectually dishonest person will always resort to fallacious arguments. And as I discussed before, the straw man fallacy is one of their most popular fallacies used. And this can mostly be explained because they're not listening to what the other person is saying. And they're not listening because the other person isn't parroting what they want to believe. So the fallacious arguments typically come from the propaganda that they've consumed, and then they go out into the real world and they repeat those fallacious arguments. But when they're confronted, then they start strawmanning or lashing out or doing these other things. They're only interested in being right or winning. Excuses and distortions or changing the subject, going on long tangents, these are all tactics widely used by these individuals. In addition to these common tactics, you'll notice that these people often have delusions about their intelligence. Intellectually honest people are honest about subjects or topics they do not know well enough, and they're willing to both admit and learn more. The intellectually dishonest person will instead insist that they know more than the police, the investigators, the forensic scientists, or other specialists, though they have no background or education in these areas. And again, an intellectually honest person will say, I don't know, and feel very comfortable with that. An intellectually dishonest person is unable to admit defeat. Now, when it comes to many of these true crimes we see in so-called documentaries claiming the innocence of a certain person, we see the manipulated audience members demand information or evidence that is not even necessary in order to establish that person's guilt. For example, we don't need to know the exact manner in which a person was murdered. We need to know who is responsible for that murder. And this can be easily proven with trials where guilt was found and a body was missing. Those who have been manipulated by propaganda will almost always express inconsistent ideas, standards, and demands of others. And we can witness this whenever a person is quick to jump to bizarre conspiracies or excuses and favor that conclusion instead of accepting the facts that have been already laid out. So in the case of Michael Jackson, for instance, we see defenders making claims that victims and their families were extorting him, right? They have this big conspiracy that they favor. They'll claim that everyone was lying. The police or the DA were after him. There's never an ounce of evidence that actually proves any of their assertions. They actually attempt to back up their claims with information that has long been proven to be manipulated or just an outright lie. So if we take the phone call recording of Jordan's father, this call was edited and manipulated in a way to make it sound much worse. And ultimately, there was no mention of money or desire to extort Michael Jackson. And that claim was actually made by Michael's attorneys. It was investigated with the police, and the police found nothing. Now, whenever someone attempts to point out to the defenders that, this call was manipulated, that's not how it happened, they will just simply double down on their ignorance because no one told them. The call that you see passed around in Michael Jackson supporter groups, this is it for them. So when you present them with the fact that no, that's not an actual representation of the phone call. That call was edited. It was manipulated to make it sound much worse than what it really was. This is where they just double down on their ignorance. And they insist that it proves their narrative, that there was this big conspiracy against Michael Jackson. And again, they have no evidence to prove any of the victims lied about their molestation or that the DA was after Michael. But because the belief in these things support their conclusion, it must be true. And while making all these claims, they will then dismiss all the evidence that demonstrates Jackson was indeed a pedophile. An intellectually honest person whose ego is not in the way would not simply dismiss a grown man who continually spent all his time with little boys and sleeping in bed with those little boys and doing so even after being accused of being a pedophile or possessing books commonly found among other known pedophiles. An intellectually honest person cannot simply dismiss or excuse these pieces of evidence, and of which there are so many. I made a series on these things, okay? Go listen to them. There are simply too many things, too many bits of evidence that clearly conclude Michael Jackson was indeed a pedophile. Now, if we look at the Stephen Avery case, we see fans who are desperate to conclude that the police planted evidence and that other people were involved. Almost everyone but Stephen and Brendan has been accused, yet not one piece of evidence has ever been discovered that shows anyone else being involved. I mean, poor Zellner. She said right out of the gate she was going to prove he was innocent. How long has it been? 2 years now? I mean, it's been a long time. She has nothing. Now she puts out $100,000 reward. There's nothing. There's no evidence of police being on Avery's property. There's no witnesses. There's no DNA. There's no motive other than some bizarre fantasy world where police are motivated to protect an insurance company. I mean, this was their whole thing, where the whole case is hinged upon they didn't want Stephen Avery to get $32 million. Excuse me, just because you sue for $32 million doesn't mean you're going to get $32 million. Wisconsin has a cap on the damages that can be claimed by people who are wrongfully accused anyway, so the idea that he was going to get that much money is so absurd. It's so far from reality that it's painstakingly disturbing that anybody thinks that it could possibly be true. But in any case, the most he would have gotten, which I don't even think he would be capable of getting, because he was also imprisoned for a crime in which he did commit, which was pulling a poor woman off the road who had a baby in her vehicle in the middle of winter and put a gun to her head. This is a violent man. I really doubt he was going to get more than $1 million, if he would get that at all. The insurance pays for this. Why would the police care about protecting an insurance company? Makes no sense. Absolutely nothing shows involvement of anyone else. Yet for some reason, this no evidence, it's reasonable enough for supporters to point the finger in another direction. So at the same time, there seems to be no evidence good enough for them to prove Stephen and Brendan are indeed guilty, despite all known evidence showing their guilt. Instead, they make excuses, they blame others, again exposing no proof for these accusations towards others. So let's do a little recap. Number one, yes, innocent people can indeed be falsely accused. Fortunately, with today's knowledge, scientific advancements, and improved investigation skills, these cases are not common. We have appeals, we have checks and balances, and we have a right to a defense that allows people to tell their side of the story. As we saw, Russ Faria eventually did get his appeal. His case was thrown out. So we just have to remember that there are all kinds of things around us to fear. We could get into an accident. We could fall down and break a leg. We could, I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of scenarios around us to be afraid of, but we can't focus on all of those things because life would be miserable if that's all we focused on. So propaganda tries to play upon these fears that anybody might have. They're not exactly fears that we need to be all that concerned about. The majority of people are not in prison, and the majority of people who are in prison are guilty. Number two, innocent people are consistent in their stories. They do not tailor information to fit what was discovered during the investigation. When Russ was asked about why his slippers had blood on them, he didn't change his story to say, oh yeah, I forgot to say I put my slippers on when I walked in the house, or something to that effect. Instead, he just said, I don't know. Honest people who are innocent will oftentimes not have an explanation for every little action. They're not going to know what evidence is there because they're innocent. Number three, corruption with the police or authorities. Again, this can happen when multiple people are involved with something nefarious. It's pretty inevitable that someone talks or slips up somewhere. Yes, these things do occur, and nobody should believe otherwise. We must be open to these types of discussions and accept that this stuff does indeed happen. The problem is we need proof. Just as we need proof when it comes to going after anyone else, the standard should not change. We cannot simply accuse the police of corruption because we don't like what they have to say. Number four, I've already spoken about what propaganda is and how to identify it. Its goal is to appeal to your emotions, and ultimately the individual's ego will take over. It is this ego that stands in our way of looking at things objectively, and those who have large egos will express both weak character and inevitably become intellectually dishonest. So it's very important that we keep our egos in check and learn to recognize when we've gone too far or we're not being intellectually intellectually honest. Number 5, intellectual dishonesty can be identified when a person is unable to formulate their argument or address questions directly. It's very difficult to ask somebody who is a supporter of these murders, rapists, and pedophiles a direct question. They often fail because they do not have the ability to answer direct questions. They have to go on their tirades and their narrative and continue making the same fallacious arguments over and over again that they've been fed. They will use fallacies to convey their arguments. They will attempt to bully you into believing their narrative. Insults and other internet banter, that can be expected from anyone. But ultimately, the intellectually dishonest people, they tend to resort only to making excuses and accusations against anyone and everyone who doesn't buy their narrative. They will never express their ignorance on any particular topic despite their lack of education or skill in a particular area or subject. Rather than following the evidence that's laid out before them, they will, as I said, lead the evidence to create their own conclusion. And they often achieve this by excusing evidence. He never had a childhood. He would never hurt a child, despite the fact that many pedophiles do not believe they are hurting children. The lab contaminated the evidence. We've all heard this. This is a claim widely made in many of these cases, yet there's never a shred of evidence showing the contamination, or if there was a contamination, how did that specific contamination somehow change the genetic material found? So again, there's sort of an ignorance there. And intellectually dishonest people will often display intellectual laziness. And this is often expressed when someone is cherry picking information. So a person will often look for specific things to prove their point, yet not take the time to further investigate whether that information is factual or even in its context. So as I pointed out before with the recorded phone call with Evan Chandler, the call played on the news, it was edited in such a way to make the call sound damaging and make Evan look like a monster of some kind. It was much more damaging than the reality of the situation, because when one reads the transcript, they will easily find that Evan does not speak about money, nor was he trying to extort Jackson. But good luck trying to get a supporter to actually read these things. Ultimately, our goals here are to recognize the value of critical thinking and how to go about being more objective, which means putting our egos in check and remaining intellectually honest in our approach to all topics, and especially as it pertains to this series where we're talking about true crime cases. So in the next episode, I'm going to delve a little bit further into the topic of clear and rational thinking. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and I will be back.